Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We apologize for the delay. We had a few technical difficulties, but thank you so much for joining in for our Transforming Habits webinar. Just as a reminder, we are on Facebook Live, so if you could share that with your people, you can find the stream on the Khalil Center USA and the Khalil Center Canada pages. So today, Dr. Amr will be discussing the science of behavior change and learning how to change your habits, as well as helping others to change their habits. Dr. Amr Rahimullah is a clinical assistant professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, where he specializes in the treatment of addictions. He is the director of the Addiction Medicine Consult Service at Stanford Hospital and a clinical advisor at Lucid Lane, an online therapy company that treats addiction. So Dr. Amar's video will be off today, but he will be presenting a slideshow for all of us to follow along. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Amar.
Hi everyone, assalamu alaikum. So we'll be talking about transforming habits. Just wanted to go over the outline. Essentially what we'll be talking about is how are habits formed, how do they work, and how are they removed. So once we understand how they're formed, we can really understand how to incorporate good habits. Once we understand how they work, we can understand how they operate and how to propagate good habits, and also how to deconstruct habits. And once we know how they work, we can help learn how to remove habits as well. Probably the most interesting thing to me about habits is the intention habit paradox. So in other words, we have on one end what we intend to do, and then on the other end what we sort of fall back into doing in terms of our habits. So for example, we could want to eat healthier. So take an individual, for example, who's just diagnosed with diabetes. He's a rational human being. He makes the decision that he wants to stop eating unhealthy and eat in a more healthy manner. So he comes home, he makes the plan to eat healthier, he makes an announcement to his family members, friends, he does all the math for the calories, and he sets out his plan. So on one end, we're habits of rational humans. And on the other end, we're sort of creatures of habits. So the same individual who wants to eat healthier after a period of time, maybe success for days, weeks, may end up relying back on their habits. And the most fascinating part of this for me is in the moment that we're making that intention and that plan, we're almost convinced, we're very confident that we'd be able to carry out that plan. And at the moment where we sort of lean back into our habits, it's so mysterious how that happened. Almost like, how did we end up back here again? And that gap is something that's always fascinated me, and what we're going to try to explore today. What makes that discrepancy happen? Now, nudges is a term that behavioral economists use, and it's basically what can we do to drive people's behavior so they go from their intended behavior. So what can we do to drive people's behavior to get them to a certain goal? And it's interesting that behavioral economists are interested in our behaviors, first off. And it goes to show how important it is for us to take responsibility for our habits. So, because if we don't, recognizing that other people are targeting our habits in order to nudge our behaviors in certain ways. And really, if we look at some of our habits, let's say, for example, our eating habits, some of these eating habits may simply be traced back to somebody nudging our habits in a certain way. So it's important to understand our habits so that we can take control over them and nudge them ourselves in a certain way. So, we understand that intentions versus habits, there's a difference and there's a discrepancy. But we are not necessarily our intentions, we are our habits. And that's where the problem happens. So, for example, with our health, despite our best intentions to change our eating habits, we end up being our habits. So um, a convergence of our eating habits. We're a convergence of our sleeping habits. So our health is not affected necessarily by our intentions, but by the habits that make us up. Similarly, our relationships. Our relationships aren't a product of our intentions or our plans or what we hope to do after, let's say, a marriage seminar or what we hope to do after a parenting seminar. But what they end up being is a convergence of our habits. So, our communication habits, our reactive patterns with our family members, and then finally, our success. It's, we can have a flash of inspiration, we can have a passion, but our success is essentially determined by our study and our work habits. So, what we do on a day-to-day basis, how our time management is, what's the in and out on the day-to-day basis. Okay, so now how are habits formed? So when we start any new behavior, the first time we do something, it requires our conscious attention. So take, for example, driving. The first time you drive, you have to consciously be aware of where your hands are on the steering wheel. You have to consciously be aware of the cars zipping past you. You're just more alert and aware and present. Then, after a period of time, repeating that action over and over and over again, behaviors become automatic through repetition. And as they become automatic, they become habitual, and the decision making part of our brain essentially goes to sleep. And there's a good side to this. So, habits are good. So, when we have more mental energy to do something else, then our brain can work on something else. So, while we're driving, now when it's habitual, we can talk on the phone, or we can listen to a podcast, or we can do something else. Hopefully, not too much else. But the bad side is there's an inability to switch off these habits. So once habits get formed, maybe in a period of stress, maybe they're habits that happen during childhood that kind of just follow us along during adulthood and aren't necessarily sustainable anymore. The bad side is when we're unable to switch these habits off. Now, another way to conceptualize habits is simply through looking at it from the perspective of the brain. And this can be really helpful for a lot of reasons. Now, neuroscientists look and trace and link the habit forming part of our brain to a place called the basal ganglia. So, basal ganglia is important for rewarding our behaviors, motivating our behaviors, and creating habits and routines. And there's another important part of our area called the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is the area of our brain that is involved in planning and self control. It pumps the brakes on our habits. So, if you think about the previous example about driving, if you have to drive to a new place, for example, let's say to a new job or new school, now the first time you drive to that new place, it might be a little different because you have to be aware of what street you're on, where you're turning, where you have to stop. And as you get used to that new route the next day and the day after that, you're essentially creating new routes in your brain and new sort of neural pathways. And as you create that, you are moving from more conscious behavior to more habitual behaviors. Now, the good thing is our brains are neuroplastic, so they can change over time. So, despite having a really difficult ingrained habit, our brains can certainly learn new habits and be retrained and rewired. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about. How do we rewire our brains? But one thing to keep in mind is, just like as we are taking a habitual route to this new job or new school, we can learn how to take another route. And as we take that other route to school and work every day, we burn new pathways into our brain. And as we burn those new pathways into our brain, they become new habits. And as we rely less on our old habits or old pathways, those slowly diminish or extinguish in our brain. Now, looking at it from the perspective of the brain can be helpful, because then we can just look at it objectively. Oftentimes with habits, especially habits that have been around for a while, that we've struggled with or battled with for a while, or sometimes habits that have a lot of shame around them or pain around them, there can be a lot of sort of guilt and shame and compounded shame, and that can be sometimes not constructive. So if we look at it from the example of not, oh, I did it again, or um, beating ourselves up too much, if we look at it from the perspective of the brain, then it's simply finding the threshold that requires us to create that new pathway. So in other words, what is that threshold? How many times do I have to practice that new behavior before it becomes a habit? And how many times do I have to stop practicing that old behavior for it to no longer be a habit? And it's simply a number. For some people, it may be 157. And for some people, it might be more than that. So this takes it out of the arena of I'm a bad person, and it takes it into the arena of, okay, I failed for the 130th time, but I've made some progress. I just have to keep going until I find the threshold where now I've created a new habit. And you can almost look at it like a dichotomy between your intention system of your brain, your goal-directed system, and your habitual system of your brain. So there's things we can do to nudge our brain more towards giving energy to our intention system of our brain, and vice versa. Okay, so now at this point, I would encourage you to pick a habit. Maybe some people have a habit that they've come with, but for others, if you're not at that point, I would pick a habit, and we can sort of run it through this presentation. And we'll be doing certain activities at certain points to help see, like an experiment, if that changes the way we think about our habits. So there's all types of habits: health habits, relationship habits, screen time habits, and then other habits like addictions. So for example, with health habits, I would recommend thinking about and talking about them. If you pick a health habit or a relationship habit or whatever, I would think about it in a way that is in line with creating like a SMART goal. So for example, you want the habit to be specific. So if your habit is exercise, you don't want to say, I want to exercise more. You want to have it be a specific activity with measurable steps. So for example, I want to run. And the second letter in SMART goals or SMART habits is M. So you want it to be measurable. So I want to run 1 hour a day, or I want to run 1 hour a day for 5 days a week. Uh, that's certainly measurable, but not necessarily realistic for everyone. So the third thing you want is, you want your goal to be attainable. So I want to run 20 minutes a day for 3 days a week. So maybe that's more attainable for people. And when you think about creating a SMART habit or a SMART goal for your habit, you really want to do something that instantly feels achievable. And then you can add to that. You don't want to choose something that's too pie in the sky and then break your morale before you've even started. So you want to start with something small, easy, build up your morale, your energy, your confidence in yourself, and then escalate from there. And then you want the habit to be relevant to you. So, you know, it may be that your doctor wants you to exercise for a certain reason, your spouse may want you to exercise for another reason, but you may have a different reason for you. So you want to find the reasons for you, not the reason that you're supposed to have, but the reason that really moves you internally. So, for example, in this example, let's say your habit is for stress relief. So now you can take that habit and make it relevant to you and make it relevant to designing this habit. So you can create that habit around work if work is what's stressful for you. So before work or after work. And then you want to create a time to it. You want to finish line. So I'm going to do this for the next week, or I'm going to do this for the next month and measure how I do. Again, try to resist the temptation of just saying, I'm going to do it for a year or I'm going to do it for 6 months, simply because that's how long you want the habit to be around for. But try to do it for a short and measurable period of time. Okay, so we've picked our habit, and now we're going to look at how habits work. And it all revolves around four things. Habits have four things that make them up. All habits start with a trigger or a cue. And then that cue leads to a craving. And then the craving will lead to a response. And then the response leads to a reward. Now, this is important because if any of these four parts of the habit are not happening, the habit won't occur, or the habit won't form, and the behavior won't occur. So we'll go into these four in a little bit more depth. And this is called different things. Some people will call this the behavior change. Some people will call this the habit loop. But it all points to habits basically revolving around these four things. So, I would encourage you to think about your habits in this way. So, okay, so a practical example of running through a habit through the behavior change or the habit loop. So, if you think about a habit, it'll be, again, made up of craving, a cue or a trigger, cravings, behavior, or reward. Okay, so let's say, for example, your habit that you're trying to change is to reduce screen time. So you've created a SMART goal around screen time. You said, I'm going to reduce screen time to 1 hour after work. Now, let's look at the habit loop. Let's say it's your hour after work. I'm sorry. Let's say it's after that hour. Now let's look at a trigger. So a trigger would be something like your phone buzzes. So now you're past that hour that you can look at your screen time, but your phone buzzes. It's a trigger. And that trigger leads to, of course, this intense craving and urge to not look at your phone. It could be life shattering. It could be something really important. But then, of course, it ends up being something really simple, like, some sort of update on Facebook or something like that. And then you go from craving to the behavior. So now the urge happens, and then you just go into the behavior. You click on your phone, you open it, use your thumb to swipe, and then the reward. So afterwards, you find out what's in your phone, and you're entertained or you're distracted. So now, once you understand this behavior chain, now you know how to deconstruct it, and now you know how to change it. And that's basically what we'll be talking about for the rest of this presentation. So in order to break a habit, you can focus on it from the trigger. So you can remove the phone. If the phone never buzzed, you would have never had an urge to open the phone and never gotten the reward from it. And also you can intervene on the craving part. So if the phone buzzed, but somehow you didn't have the urge to open it, the behavior wouldn't have happened. Or from the perspective of the behavior, if you didn't have the phone, let's say it was in a safe, you heard it buzz, you got triggered, you had the craving, but you can't get to it, you wouldn't have had the reward, and then the habit would slowly start to diminish. And similarly with the reward. Okay, so now I would encourage you to like pull out a piece of paper, and put 4 boxes in it, and try to come up with your habit and break it down to triggers, the craving behind it, the behavior, and the reward. And once you have your habit broken down in this way, then we can go into it in more depth. Now, I won't take time out to do this. We'll actually go through each part individually. At this point, I think it's sufficient just to create 4 boxes if you want to do this along with the presentation, similar to how the boxes are set up in the slide, and we can fill it in along the way. So now, starting with the trigger. So basically, to disrupt the trigger, how can I make it out of reach? And then with the craving, how do I make it less desirable? And then for the behavior, we're going to look at how do I make it conscious and not in autopilot mode? Or how do I just make it harder to carry out? How do we disrupt the behavior? And then the reward part of the habit loop. How do we make the habit or behavior less rewarding? We don't necessarily have to make it 100% not rewarding. We can look at how do we make it less rewarding, and that's a win in itself. And you know, it would be more constructive to take it from that perspective as opposed to just all or nothing and completely looking at trying to remove the reward, which is not feasible in many situations. All right, so good habits also revolve around the habit loop. So when you're thinking about how to incorporate a good habit, you can take your habit loop right here and then simply just ask the same questions. How do I make the habit more accessible and easy to reach? So if it's exercise, wanting to exercise more, how do I keep exercise equipment around me and easy to reach to trigger me to exercise? How do I make it more attractive? Or how do I make exercise fun to encourage me or make it more motivated or crave exercising? And how do I make it easier to do? And how do I make it more satisfying? How do I make exercise more rewarding? Can I couple something with the exercise to make it more rewarding? Like, for example, another rewarding activity, maybe listening to a podcast while you're exercising, so on and so forth. All right, so we're going to look at triggers a little bit more in depth. So I would start when we look at triggers by just listing triggers. So once you've identified your habit and you're starting to work out your behavior chain, listing your specific triggers. Now, let's say food is a trigger. Take junk food, for example. I'm sorry, let's say eating healthy is the habit you're working on. And let's say junk food is a trigger. So for example, proximity of the trigger to you, that's an important consideration. So junk food in the kitchen, it actually being in your proximity. And then let's say a second trigger is an emotional trigger. So many triggers may not simply be in your proximity or maybe an external trigger. Many triggers are internal triggers. So stress or feeling depressed or low can certainly be triggering for people. And then other behaviors that are coupled with that habit behavior can be a triggering situation. So it's important for, number one, if it's a proximity trigger, just to keep it out of sight. So for health habits, keeping the food out of sight. So if your kitchen's right next to you after work, or when you tend to eat more habitually, keeping the food out in the garage or out in the car, or not even buying the food and keeping it in the house. Same thing with exercise. Same thing with screen habits. If you have a screen habit, creating some distance between you and the screen. So if you're on the first floor, keeping it on the second floor. If you're in one room, keeping it in another room. Or if it's a more sort of toxic screen habit, um, putting the phone in a safe, or downloading software for it, or simply removing access completely. Um, or if it's some sort of addiction, like let's say smoking, removing ashtrays, lighters, washing your clothes from the smoke smell, and kind of purging your house of it. So keeping it out of sight and out of smell. Now you can almost look at habits based on the distance of your trigger. Again, kind of looking at it from an objective perspective and experimenting through a trial and error process as to where the threshold is for you in terms of keeping the trigger away from you, whatever that habit is for you. So you can almost look at it like a linear line, where when you get more towards the left, towards the habit, when you get more towards the left, when the trigger's closer to you, you can look at your habit brain running at 100 miles per hour or at 100%. But if your triggers are more distant, then your habit brain being diminished and its control over you being diminished by 10%. And then more, if it's even farther, by 20%. And if it's even farther, so on and so forth, until it's completely diminished and it's not even, your habit system in your brain doesn't have a hold on you. Now, people can also be a trigger. So you can have trigger that's an actual object, but you can have trigger that are people. And this is a really interesting study in the New England Journal of Medicine, which looked at the question of, do your social networks, or do people around you have an effect on your eating habits? So they looked at people over the course of 30 years. They just kept doing physical exams and evaluations of people over this 30-year period, and learned about their social networks, and asked the question of what relationships affect people's eating habits. And they looked at the objective measure of eating habits of simply your weight, which is an objective measure of your eating habits. So, and what's interesting is what they found is that, of course, the chance of becoming overweight and your eating habits changed increased if a loved one became overweight. Okay, you can say that's common sense. We know that choosing your friends or choosing the people around you are important in the creation of habits and in guiding and in breaking habits. But what's interesting is that they were able to really quantify it and look at, well, how much of an effect did this happen? And they found that the chance of a person becoming significantly overweight increased by 50%, 57% if their friend became significantly overweight. So now we're not talking about being overweight, we're talking about eating habits and habits. So essentially, being overweight is just an indicator of the person's eating habits. So essentially what's being said is your habits, the eating habits changed significantly if a friend's eating habits changed significantly. Now, for siblings, the increase was 40%, and if a spouse became significantly overweight, the increase was 37%. And this wasn't just people seeking out other people who had the same eating habits. They followed people over a period of time and found that these social networks that already existed changed over time according to these habits. So what does this mean? Does this mean in order to change a habit, you have to go out and and cancel all your friendships and remove people from your life. No, of course not. But keep in mind that there is a period when making habits where you have to just keep into consideration that people around you may influence your habits. So when it comes to really toxic habits, let's say like more addictive habits, like let's say pornography or smoking or other habits like eating habits that become really significant, like you have to change your diet or you're going to die eventually, or you just had a heart attack or you're suffering from diabetes. When it becomes a really important habit to change, recognize that there's a process that occurs to make that habit change. And at least for the early part of that process, it may be worth limiting your time with people who engage in that same habit in order for your habit to take hold or for you to start strengthening your the intention part of your brain and less so your habit part of your brain. Um, okay, so we talked about objects as a trigger and the proximity of objects as a trigger. We talked about people as a trigger. Now, this is a really important trigger, especially now in the context that we find ourselves in COVID, with social isolation, with emotional, the emotional up and down of all the consequences of COVID, with family members falling ill and some passing away, with job insecurity and loss. We're finding ourselves in a really stressful sort of time for many people. And many of us may find that habits that we were previously extinguished or not really a problem anymore are suddenly a problem again. And we've fallen back into these habits. So these could be poor health habits like eating, drinking, so on and so forth. This could be poor relationship habits. So many of us are sort of like sheltering at home and spending a lot of time with our kids and our family members, our spouses, and so on and so forth. So we may find that we're sort of regressing to poor communication habits that we've worked on to sort of move on from. So maybe we're more reactive around family members. Maybe we're more critical around family members that we've worked hard on trying to move past, so on and so forth. And this can also be for like addictive habits and other habits as well. So, and there's the reason why I bring this up is because if we understand how stress plays a part in our habits, we can really understand how to get around that. Um, one one study looked at laboratory rats, and they got these laboratory rats to get in the habit of lever pressing. And the way they were able to press, or actually many studies involve laboratory rats with lever pressing. And the way they're able to get these laboratory rats to get in the habit of pressing the lever compulsively and repetitively is by giving them strong rewards each time they press that lever. Many of these lever pressing studies involve strong rewards to create these habits faster. So they'll include morphine or methamphetamines or really strong drugs to create these rewards to then create these habits faster. What they find is fascinating with these laboratory rats. Once they give these laboratory rats these drugs, and they do this in several different ways, and the habit of lever pressing has occurred, and these laboratory rats become compulsively obsessed with the lever pressing, so much so to the detriment of their health, and they keep pressing the lever. They take the drugs away. Once they take the reward away, the animal continues to press the lever. It continues to press the lever, and slowly over time, because there's no reward, the lever pressing slows down and the habit goes away. Now, they leave the laboratory rat alone for a period of time, and the laboratory rat goes on with its normal laboratory rat life with the running wheel, eating, drinking. And then what happens is researchers stress the laboratory rat, and they'll either through pain and electric shock, or through fatigue. They'll throw them in a bucket of water till fatigue, or through putting them next to an aggressive animal, um, so on and so forth. And what they find is very interesting. After these habits have been extinguished in these laboratory rats, once they're stressed, these laboratory rats go back to pushing the lever compulsively. They go back into their habits. They fall back into their habits. And it shows that it's not necessarily based on a sophisticated psychology. There might be something biologic going on here on the level of the brain. And the wealth of the research out there on stress and habits suggests that stress has a direct impact on the neural pathways that prolong, intensify, and bring back habits. So it's very important to manage stress, especially an early part of changing habits. It's very important to manage stress, and it also answers the question for many of us who are struggling with habits, have been struggling with habits for a long period of time, have done successful, and then out of the blue, the habit just seemingly comes back. It's a mystery. 5 months later, 6 months later, a year later, we've got it down to just once or twice a year. It just comes back. And we don't see that anything really triggered it, or we weren't feeling emotionally different or physically. We didn't see any object trigger, but it simply can be due to stress. Now, with humans, there's a good acronym called HALT, where it can help us to keep an eye on our stress levels. And HALT is made up of hungry, angry, lonely, tired, making sure we're not in these states and managing these states. And again, we can look at our habit from the perspective of stress management. So the higher our stress levels are, the stronger our habit brain is working. And the lower our stress levels are, or the more we're able to manage our stress, the less our habit system of our brain has a hold on us. And then triggers can be subconscious as well. Sometimes when we don't have stress and there's no trigger that we can identify and stressors just come out of the blue, the question is when or why did a craving start? And it can simply just happen subconsciously. Our brain is continuously analyzing our environment, our internal and our external environment. And studies show that when triggers are showed to people in short bursts, let's say in 33 milliseconds or less, when triggers are shown to people and they can't consciously identify the trigger, the areas associated with craving in the brain still light up. The habit system still lights up in the brain. And so what this shows is that triggers can have an effect on us subconsciously before we're even consciously aware of them. All right, so understanding triggers is incredibly important. And now we'll move on to the second part of the habit loop, which is cravings. So once we've optimized trying to remove the triggers, we can move on to looking at the cravings and simply look at making the habit less desirable. So cravings are a desire for engaging in the behavior. They're that feeling of, I have to do it now. They're a strong urge or craving. Cravings, sometimes when triggers can't be controlled, are just the most critical problem. How do I deal with these cravings? The good news is cravings operate on the level of the mind so that they can be addressed on the level of the mind. One way to address cravings is simply through logic, or a fancy term, using cognitive behavioral approaches. The idea behind using logic is that there are many myths around cravings that make managing them difficult. And unrealistic beliefs about cravings can make cravings worse and more uncomfortable. One way to kind of take a logical approach to cravings is just looking on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is this craving? Is this something that I can simply just bear and work through, like distract myself until it passes? So, some examples of illogical beliefs about cravings and the logical strategies we can use to address them. One is urges will keep getting worse until I cave in. A logical strategy to address that is recognizing that urges peak and then die down. There's no urge or craving that's ever lasted persistently forever, um, or for even longer than. Oftentimes, they don't last longer than minutes or seconds. Or another illogical belief: urges make me behave in a certain way. And a logical way to rationalize that is urges always represent a choice. And there are many examples. This is more to serve as an introduction to recognize that behaviors can be addressed on the level of cravings, and um, to look further into that. And if you're somebody that is already working on cognitive behavioral approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, to simply use the skills you learned there to apply them to your habits. And this has been shown in many studies to be incredibly effective in addressing habits. Another tool is mindfulness. So, mindfulness for many people brings up a whole range of ideas come into the mind. I'm simply talking about mindfulness as a practice of being in the present moment. And when we talk about mindfulness for behaviors that are unconscious, simply being bringing conscious awareness to unconscious behaviors. Um, the idea is that what's happening when you look at the behavioral chain, when you're going from triggers to cravings to the actual behavior, what mindfulness does is it decouples the craving from the actual behavior. So you're present with the craving, but not reacting with it, and essentially decoupling it from the habitual reaction. Um, and mindfulness, there are many terms for it. The reason why I use the term mindfulness is because that's the term that's used in the scientific literature. So the interventions that are looked at are, are mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindfulness-based relapse prevention. And it's usually mindfulness-based intervention. So mindfulness something is often used in the literature. And the literature shows that mindfulness improves stress, it improves mood, it improves our non-reactivity skills. Um, and the idea is to practice mindfulness and learn how to yield it during the moment of a craving. And there are many exercises out there um, that are specific to how do you deal with the craving in the moment. And then also when habits become strong habits, even habits that are like drug and alcohol habits, mindfulness has been shown to reduce cravings in these really strong impulsive habits as well. So imagine what they can do for less strong habits. The last tool, and of course this is not an exhaustive list. There are many strategies out there on how to deal with cravings. The idea for this presentation is really just to open up that there is a science behind behavior change, and there are things out there that can push the needle towards your intended behaviors, and away from your habitual behaviors. And exercise is worth mentioning because it's been studied a lot for habits and strong habits. So take, for example, one study that looked at exercise in smoking habits, in the habit of smoking, the very strong habit of smoking. It found that exercise rapidly reduced cravings for smoking, and they remained reduced for up to 50 minutes afterwards. And there are many studies that have been shown in laboratory rat studies as well. Uh, when you look at the model that we discussed previously about laboratory rats pushing the lever, getting addicted to a reward, the reward gets removed, and then they're triggered again. Or researchers also look at how does exercise change this. And what they find is for these laboratory rats that have developed a habit, exercise helps in all stages. So it slows the development of a habit in laboratory rats. It also, once the habit has developed, it reduces the habit. So the lever pressing decreases. And then also, after the habit has been extinguished and removed, it protects against relapse to that habit. So it protects against relapse to the habit. So it's certainly, exercise is certainly something that uh, is an important part of anybody trying to reduce their habits, especially if they have toxic habits or addictive habits. Um, and it's thought that exercise works being a by being a competitive inhibitor. Um, I'm sorry, by being a competitor to your habit. So your habit releases rewards, and exercise also increases a lot of the same neurotransmitters, a lot of the same feel-good chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, and other neurotransmitters. Exercise also reduces stress and anxiety and depression. So it also reduces some of the triggers that can bring us back to those habits. Okay, so now that we've talked about triggers and how to deal with triggers and cravings and how to disrupt the habit loop at the level of cravings, what about the actual behavior itself? Uh, is there anything we can do to make that behavior more conscious or harder to carry out? Because part of the problem is that the behavior just continuously repeats on autopilot. Many times we're in the middle of a behavior before we are even aware that the behavior is happening. We almost wake up in the middle of it. It's a really interesting phenomenon. Now, attacking that autopilot phenomenon works. So one way to make that autopilot phenomenon disrupt that autopilot phenomenon is simply to make it more conscious and recording those behaviors. So, for example, they looked at people with eating habits, and this has been shown in numerous studies. The simple act of recording your eating habits leads to less eating and better eating habits and leads to weight reductions. Being precise about recording the habit isn't as important as um, actually um, recording the habit. So simply recording the habit is incredibly important. So simply recording the habit has been shown to reduce these behaviors. The studies that have looked at this look at people who record what they ate, when they ate it, how much they ate, and record their weight. That's been helpful. Recording calories has been helpful. And then this can be used for all our habits. So screen time habits, simply on a daily basis, creating a practice of recording your screen time habits. And many devices will automatically have that built in. So being aware of how many hours am I spending on the screen, and in what times of day is that happening, can really limit and help us focus our interventions on those areas in the day. And there's apps out there for all types of habits, um, all types of habits, uh, too many to count. Or simply just being old-fashioned about it and just pulling out a piece of paper or recording it on your phone or your Gmail or whatever, and just recording when the habit occurred, and then just keeping a time log of when it's happening. And just creating that time log can start moving you towards, well, when do I need to focus all these interventions? And then once you know where to focus those interventions, you get an idea of, well, how often is this happening and how significant of a problem is it? Because for many people, half of the battle is just becoming aware of how significant the habit has become, or becoming conscious of that habit. And a lot of times there can be so much shame and guilt compounded around a habit that we just can't even acknowledge it. It's like psychologically, we just can't acknowledge it. Maybe we're the community leader, or we're the therapist, or we have this role where we, on one end, we it's almost as if we can't even acknowledge this bad habit occurring within us, because we just have to focus on being able to do the work. Okay, all right. So this has also been shown to exercise. So recording exercise leads to more exercise, more enjoyment of the exercise. And studies show that people will exercise more if they're just given a pedometer, if they're just able to count their steps. You don't even have to give them a goal. As long as they're counting their steps, they see that number increase. And when we see numbers increase, we have this irrational dopamine increase, and we just start doing that activity more. Just by virtue of um, following that, recording that habit leads to enhanced motivation in that area. And finally, the reward. So how do we make the reward less rewarding? And this doesn't need to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be about completely removing the reward, otherwise we've failed. So again, the whole habit loop, it's essentially, you can think about it as being based on the reward. So a trigger is your brain noticing the reward. A craving is your brain wanting the reward, and a behavior is what you're doing in order to obtain that reward. So from one perspective, it's all about the reward. And in fact, if you remember the laboratory rats, they stop pushing the lever once they no longer have a reward. And if we're able to reduce the reward or make our good habits more rewarding, then we're able to really increase these habits. And finally, I'll end on this. This is a really strong and important exercise that's been incredibly helpful for people in not only enhancing their motivation towards their behaviors, but also to help almost create a blueprint of how they should approach their behaviors. So, for example, in this exercise, people list the pros and cons of not changing their behavior, or the pros and cons of their behavior, and then the pros and cons of changing their behavior. So, for example, if it's screen time, or if it's working on your communication habits, or or any of that, you would write, what are the pros and cons of the behavior? Like, what do I get out of this behavior? What are the pros of this behavior? So if the behavior is eating junk food or eating high calorie foods, what do I get out of it? It satisfies me, it distracts me. So we look at the pros. It distracts me, it helps entertain me, so on and so forth. And then what are the cons? So when we look at the pros, then we look at the list that we've put in the pros then gives us an idea of why we do the behavior and the types of things we can use to replace those rewards with healthier alternatives. And then the cons give us our motivators of why we're making this behavior change. And then you do the same thing, but you look at the pros and cons of changing your behavior. So the pros of changing your behavior give us, again, our motivators for changing the behavior, and the cons for changing our behavior give us a list of what we can do to make changing that behavior more appealing or more rewarding. Like, for example, coupling with that change behavior something rewarding. So if your change behavior is wanting to incorporate exercise, coupling that with listening to a podcast, so on and so forth. Okay, great. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions.
So there was a question about procrastination.
Okay, great. I see the questions. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Um, okay, let me see what questions we have. Um, okay. How do you help yourself from, let's see, was there one before that? How do you help yourself from food addiction and the guilt of having food when others don't? Okay, that's a great question. So, eating habits and habits in general can progress to the point where they become addictions in the sense that they start to really impede on our functioning. So in other words, they start to become so unhealthy that they disrupt our family relationships, and they severely disrupt our work, so on and so forth. So, one way to approach addictions is simply through what I've described in the presentation. But then also, if it progresses, and again, if any of these any of these habits progress to addiction, I would really encourage people to seek out professional help, because really one of the defining and characteristic features of addiction is simply that it's come to a point where you just need more help and professional help in order to guide through that problem. Um, I would encourage you to seek out a therapist, or specifically specialized in your area of addiction. So there are therapists around food addiction. There's support groups around food addiction. There's also medications out there that can help reduce cravings towards food, so on and so forth. Speaking with a dietitian can help, so on and so forth. There's definitely concerted, organized plans to help people with food problems, food addictions, and also with other addictions as well. So when you want to find help with, let's say, another addiction, like a pornography addiction or a drug and alcohol addiction, you want to find professionals and therapists who are specifically trained in those areas. What about procrastinating? This is a great question. People will progress through stages in their wanting to change. So we start at a stage where we're not even contemplating change, or we may not even be aware of there being a need to change. Then we go to a place where we're starting to contemplate change, really. There's a stage where we're really trying to contemplate, looking at the pros and cons of change. Then we get to the stage where we're preparing to change. Change is on the horizon. It's 3 to 6 months. We're just looking for that event to occur to push the needle and just push us over the edge. And then we get to a point where we're readily taking action. And then once we've taken action, we get to a stage where we just need to maintain those gains. Now, when we're at a stage where we're contemplating change or preparing change, there are several things we can do to enhance our motivation to get to the next step. One of the strongest activities is the pros and cons worksheet that I had at the end of the presentation. Many motivational enhancement, motivational interviewing books and guidelines will recommend doing activities like that, looking at the pros and cons of using or of your behavior and the pros and cons of stopping and going towards that. It can also help to create those SMART goals like we discussed specifically and create small attainable steps. So a lot of times we procrastinate or we have analysis paralysis because we're trying to create an all or nothing goal. So instead of like going on the 3 month diet or the 6 month diet and doing the insane workout, simply incorporate something really easy, you know, absolutely easy that you can do in the next day. You're 100% confident you can carry it out, and then slowly turn the dial up from there. Do you think we can use this approach for things like promise breaking, or would that be too big? No, not at all. I think that's really smart that you're able to make that connection. This can be, when I talk about food as a habit or smoking as a habit or exercise as a habit, I'm just using examples that would relate to the majority of people. And you can certainly use this for anything that you do consistently that you want to break. Habits are what make us up as human beings, but habits are also what make us up as societies. So, we have collective habits of as humans that need to be broken, and then we have habits as individuals that need to be broken. And this can be habits of how we relate to other people. So, how we relate to our children, how we relate to our spouses, making promises and breaking promises. All of these can be run through the habit chain. You can make a behavioral loop out of it, and you can intervene on each parts of this habit chain to slowly break these habits. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, and you can apply this to breaking promises and just in general communication habits with family members. How to manage habits with ADHD? That's a great question. So ADHD, first off, I would really encourage people, if they think they have a diagnosis of ADHD, to get a formal evaluation, and not to simply get a superficial examination, to get formal testing. So formal neuropsychiatric testing to see if you have ADHD, or maybe simply um, are more impulsive or compulsive. And that just may be uh, a product of the age we live in, the digital age we live in, or the time or age, your specific age, so on and so forth. So once you've been diagnosed with ADHD, there are there is a lot of help out there that exists for that specifically, and they and habits can and there are habits that are associated with that. But I think the best way to approach this is by first getting professional help for a diagnosis and for the treatment of ADHD. Is dopamine detox a useful tool or just pop science? Is dopamine detox? Dopamine detox, I think that might be an app. There's so many apps out there, or maybe a program. I'm just not aware of it. But the idea of detoxing from dopamine, in other words, the idea of letting your brain simply rest and have a period of abstinence from your behavior is incredibly important to allow your reward pathway to reset and to be stimulated by natural rewards or by other rewards. Um, and to then, now when your reward pathway is reset, then it essentially is resetting your behavioral loop. Um, Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. How do we make triggers no longer a trigger? So yeah, I would consider exposing yourself to a trigger as more of an advanced technique. Um, and that's if you can't avoid a trigger, remove a trigger, or manage a trigger. One way to expose yourself to a trigger is to do it visually, to visualize yourself, hopefully with a therapist or maybe with a coach. If not, you can do it yourself, but that's a less ideal way. And it really depends on how dangerous the habit is. If it's a dangerous habit, it may not be constructive to expose yourself or to visualize exposing yourself to a trigger, because that can be dangerous, um, if the habit is dangerous. But there isn't a practice of visualize exposing yourself, visualizing yourself exposing yourself to the trigger, and then in that moment practicing some of the tools that we've learned today or some of the tools that you may learn. That's a good question. So eating habits. So the question is, every time we think or do the same thing, a pathway called a neural circuit is formed and it gets worse. Can the same thing happen if we only eat sweets once a week or once a month, or is it better to just stop eating sweets altogether? So it's a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, if you stop eating sweets altogether, or if you stop your habit altogether, then and go into a period of being habit free, then it allows your brain to reset faster and in the fastest way. But for many people, that's just not practical. It's not a practical goal. And in order to make good goals, we have to make those smart, attainable goals. So a great goal would be to simply reduce the frequency of eating sweets or reducing it to once a week, so on and so forth. Something that's attainable, but then also something you can reduce as much as you can. So finding a frequency that's easy for you to attain, but is also reduced from what your normal frequency is, will help your brain reset. Okay, great. Thanks everybody for joining. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yes, thank you everyone for tuning in. And thank you so much, Dr. Amr, for coming on and teaching us about fixing ourselves. And so I think this will be the end of the webinar. Thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Dr. Amr. And